Simon, nice to meet you. Thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell me about your business, what it is, what you do, how you help people.
Gosh, straight in there. Okay, so I was working in research for a very large US company. For various reasons, it decided it didn't need that research function anymore. So I I thought I'd retire. I've done all this mapping stuff and everything else. And that lasted a couple of weeks of me trying to retire. So I thought I'd form a small little business, which is what I've done. Teach people a combination of things. I teach some people how to map. I help out organizations in understanding, the technological, economic, social, and political landscapes. I do a little bit of research stuff as well. I do some public speaking. So it's a really, really small little group, which I'm just building up some capital within. And then over time, I'll look to expand into maybe some particular products that I'm building and also events as well. So it really is just an exploration for me at the moment.
So what is Wardley Maps?
Oh gosh, right. So this started 20 years ago. I was running a software company, relatively small group, at most about 40, 50, that sort of number of people, based in Old Street in London. This is before Old Street became a technological centre. And we would build all sorts of different lines of business. So we had about 16 major lines of business for different organisations. We built one of the first platform as a service offering. We had our own cloud environment before EC2 hit the scene. So when I was working in that space, I realized that most of my strategy was I didn't know what I was doing. I was making it up as I went along. We've been very successful, but I was completely clueless. And I ended up in a bookstore in Charing Cross, and I was talking to the bookseller, and they asked me had I ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And I hadn't. And so she persuaded me to buy two different versions, which was fantastic. Because it was in the reading of the second version, I noticed these 5 factors that Sun Tzu talked about. Have a purpose, a moral imperative to do something. Secondly, understand your landscape. Thirdly, understand the principles of how you organize yourself. Also understand the climatic patterns, the heavens, how the landscape is changing. And then you get into the sort of strategic gameplay. So make it simple. Purpose, landscape, climatic patterns are really next. So how things are changing. Doctrine, so principles, and then you're into gameplay. And I'm fascinated by this. And I started to look into this question of how do you map your environment. And I had loads of maps, business process maps, mind maps, customer journey maps. But it turned out they all had one thing in common. None of them were actually maps. They're all graphs. So I hadn't done an MBA. And so I thought this must be what you learn when you do an MBA, how to map your technological, economic, social, and political landscape. And I was a cheapskate. So I invented Simon's cheap and cheerful way of mapping the environment. It took me about 9 months, 9,223 publications, etc. A lot of work to build a very simple way of visualizing environment. I made it Creative Commons, and then it turned out a whole bunch of other people didn't know how to do exactly this. And so it just spread from there. And these days, I actually teach on a few. I get dragged in to teach on different MBA courses how to actually map your landscape. Because it turns out most people don't actually map their landscapes. They operate on things like narrative, stories, and graph. So that's what I did. And I did that 20 years ago, and I've used it heavily in research, in mergers and acquisitions, in shorting companies, in building companies, etc. And this is the sort of stuff that I do for a small number of clients.
Certainly, when I've looked at it, I've always been as standard at its sort of simplicity or ease of use is probably a better way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it covers so many bases compared to, let's say, a spreadsheet, which is kind of like you say, it produces graphs, it's 2-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Wardley map is, 5 dimensions and measures things like change and allows you to take account of evolution and things that happen in the real world.
It's 2-dimensional in terms of there's evolution at the bottom, and what you have is the value chain. So when you create a map, you start by thinking about the users, the user needs, and there could be many users, there could be the business, there could be customers, there could be regulators. They all have needs, and then you think about the components involved in meeting that capability and need. So you get a chain of components. Now that gives you a graph with an anchor at the top of the users and position described through a chain of needs. And what you do is you go through that entire chain, which is just different forms of capital. It could be physical capital, it could be, technological capital, it could be knowledge capital. They're all forms of capital. And just ask, how evolved are those components? Because there turns out to be 4 basic stages of evolution: the genesis of novel and new, custom-built examples, products, and then rental services. We use slightly different labels if we're talking about ethical values or we're talking about knowledge or whatever. So you can go from, a concept, emerging, converging, universally accepted. You just put those labels at the bottom. And so you just go through and ask how evolved, and that produces the map. And it's designed to be simple. If you ever look at squatters in an army looking at taking a building, they'll draw in sand and using stones a map of the territorial space. We absolutely wanted to replicate that in both the technological, economic and social political spaces. And so that's what a map is. Now you can go more advanced, you can create atlases to town, city maps and all the rest of it. And then there's a lot of economic patterns you learn. There's about 30 of those, about 40 universally useful principles that come out of mapping, and then there's over 100 different ways of gameplay and 50 ways of manipulating the market to your favor. Most people, organizations you compete against, are completely oblivious to this. So you can have a lot of fun. I used to run strategy for a company called Canonical. They provide something called Ubuntu operating system. This was back in 2008. We're 3% of the operating system market. We're up against Microsoft and Red Hat. They've got all the engineers, all the billions, blah. What we had was a map so we could focus in particular areas with a small group. And it cost me $500,000, took me 18 months. We took 70% of all cloud computing. So if you were involved in cloud between 2008 and 2010, suddenly Ubuntu was everywhere, dominated the space. You were mapped. So you can have quite big impacts by using the landscape as a force multiplier. And of course, if you can't see the landscape, you haven't got a clue what's going on. The world of narrative, so it's more wishful thinking. So I found it fun. I found it very useful for building and selling companies, and I try and help others.
I remember Ubuntu, and you're right, it came out of nowhere, if you like, compared to Red Hat and Microsoft, and became the market leader. So that was incredible. So I have a question for you. Because I recognise also the other thing you said, which is most people don't have a clue. And
But let's be clear, it's not because people are daft, it's because people are often trapped by narrative. So they can't see the environment they're competing in.
They have a single story, single viewpoint.
Think about Vikings and sunstones and maps and all the rest of it. And before that, navigation was mostly epic tales. And we use those as navigation devices. And then somebody created a map. And they probably thought, that doesn't make any sense. But of course, over time, and of course maps, much older history than that, we've developed them. And so as ways of understanding landscape. There's a beautiful piece of work called Topographical Intelligence in the American Civil War. A fantastic paper about why maps were so important, and you wouldn't talk about things like territorial sovereignty without maps. But we do this in digital landscapes or technological landscapes, economic landscapes, because we don't know how to map the space, and so that's the problem I try and tackle.
So okay, so it leads to a question for me, which I think you have addressed, but I'm going to ask it just to nail it if we can. What unconventional decision proved most pivotal in the growth of the Wardley map process?
What unconventional decision? I suppose the biggest realization, gosh, it sounds terrible. The biggest realization is that most of the tools that we use, whether they're things like SWOT diagrams or large business cases, etc., are actually not built on an understanding of the landscape itself. So the unconventional wisdom was there was an issue with situational awareness in business across technological, economic, social and political spaces. Now, I sit with organizations and they go, well, we're very successful. Well, yeah. I mean, I was very, very successful running a software company without understanding my landscape. Mostly because I'm competing against others and we're all sort of copying each other. And it mostly boils down to elements of luck. I would see people go under all the time and everything else, and I would try and hoodwink myself into believing I had some sort of great strategic knowledge, but I'm just copying others and copying their strategies, and just I didn't know, I had no idea what I was doing. And so we often fall foul of survival and the fallacy of the survivors. We look at people who are successful and think it must be something about them. It must be something about their practices or whatever. And most of this turns, these sorts of rituals and this sort of symbolism turns out to be boils down to luck most of the time. So that's, I suppose, the shocker is that most organisations operate on narrative and luck. And this is why you see huge giants disappear by the wayside because they cannot understand the space and how it's changing. And particularly, they get problems like inertia because we build up capital in certain areas of the map and that creates inertia to change and we don't realise. And the classic examples of that would be things like Blockbuster versus Netflix. Blockbuster first with a website, first with video ordering online, first with video streaming experiments, first to go bankrupt. Why? Because a pre-existing business model based on late fees which depend on physical stores. Netflix is a DVD mail order company, so it didn't have the problems and the inertia. And most organisations, they can't see that inertia, so that tends to kill them. So I suppose the unconventional wisdom is that we're all competing without looking at the environment. Actually, that's not fair. China government is fantastic at understanding economic and technological spaces, has been doing through its own method for a long time. There are some groups who've used mapping in really quite powerful ways. There's a wonderful book AWS wrote called Reaching Cloud Velocity, which is about an entire chapter on mapping, particularly a model called ILC. It's quite devastating if you play it well. And, of course, I've had my own success in terms of things like Canonical. And it wasn't because we were super smart geniuses or anything else. We're playing a game of chess. We can see the board against others who can't. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting one. You can see the board. So it leads me to another question, which I think you've answered, but I'm just going to, for clarity and specificity, I'm going to ask the question. What business assumption did you once hold firmly that you've completely reversed your position on?
So
How many?
Loads. But okay, so one in particular. I did a lot of work with government. So I wrote something called the Better for Less paper with Liam Maxwell, Mark Thompson and others. This was for Francis Maud. And that created or supported the creation of something called spend control and supported the creation of something called GDS. So this was back in 2009, 2010 we were writing this paper. And I used a lot of the basic concepts of mapping in there. But even then, it was Simon's cheap and cheerful way of doing it. So I thought there was, businesses must have had a way of doing it. I still hadn't realised that people didn't actually understand their landscape when making decisions. If I had understood that, I would have been even more clearer with using the maps. But one of the things that came out of this, a business belief I had was I always used to think that business was the sign of efficiency and government was highly bureaucratic and inefficient. And when I was working within government, the worst example of duplication I came across was 118 workflow systems doing the same thing in the same way. Basically, we'd built prisoner registration 118 different ways, one for every correctional facility or whatever it happens to be, one for every police force, etc. And I thought, wow, that 180, you can't get worse than that. I had a large pharma company who'd had 350 teams building enterprise content management systems, 5 global efforts to build a global. This is a pharma company. I mean, they were duplicating the same thing 350 different ways. I had a bank. I stopped counting at 1,000 risk management systems. I mean, they were like, when this all came out, they were like, oh my God, how can we survive? Well, the thing is, I was also working with another bank and they were just as bad. So the levels of waste and duplication I see in the private sector vastly exceeds anything I've ever seen in government. And that's mostly because of things like the National Audit Office, what used to be called the Major Projects Authority. It's now I remember the term, but it's the National Infrastructure Group, and things like spend control. So there's a lot of processes of review and challenge and questioning. Mapping just helps that challenge. And I see that in government, whereas I see in the private sector, we have the magic carpet. We do these horror shows. We lift up the magic carpet, we sweep it under, pretend it never happened. And the levels of waste and duplication I see in the private sector are just through the roof compared to government, which is why I find the stuff going on in the US somewhat quite amusing, particularly since they've got rid of the groups in particular like the GSA, which does the auditing and review. These are essential functions for efficiency, so you never want to diminish those. That's the big shocker for me, just how awful business was.
Okay, well it does lead neatly to my next question, because
Yes.
I was looking for an example of how you turn a business challenge into a thought leadership opportunity.
Sure. Okay, so I'll give you a technical one. So I'm often in the economic, social, political spaces dealing with sovereignty issues, etc. But I also love the technology. It's my background. So very simple example, insurance company, it was 2010. And they've got a bottleneck in their process. The bottleneck is about getting servers into their data center. So it's quite low level, quite technical, but this is having profound business impacts in terms of delivering services. So they looked at what was going on, servers coming into goods in, they modify, mount, and rack them, etc. And there's this big bottleneck going on. So they came up with this plan to invest in robotics. So it was going to simplify, automate the entire process. It was many millions they're about to spend. And so I was asked to go in and have just give it a once over. Now the problem is they'd already formed their narrative, and so their narrative, they've got their business case, they've got the return investment calculation sub 1 year, they'd gone through all the vendors, they'd selected their vendors and everything, they'd even had a business process, well, they call it a map, but it's a graph, identifying the bottleneck, a nice little document, all tightly done, all very sensible. And so I said, could we map it? And they were like, because I can't go in there and say, why are you doing robotics? Because I'm challenging their story. And the problem is we tell people that great leaders are great storytellers. So when you challenge somebody's narrative, you're actually saying, I don't think you're a great leader, which is why people get defensive. So I can't go in there and say, why are you doing robots? Because they got their narrative. So I said, could we map it? And they were like, 15 minutes of argument. And then we decided to map it. It took 15 minutes to map it. And so they went compute, they put it in a product, so, the business needs compute needs, it needs goods in, because that's where compute comes in from, and that's commodity. Servers, they put commodity, interestingly, compute was a product, servers commodity, and then they went mount, modify rack. And interestingly, they had racking custom built. And so one of the beauties about maps is I don't challenge people's narrative, I challenge the map, because it's an old architectural technique. We have the argument on the map. This is how I get groups of Brexiteers and Remainers to actually talk to each other, because we don't talk directly, we challenge through the map. So I simply said, why have you got racks in custom built? And they went, we have custom built racks. So what are the modifications you're making to servers? Well, they don't fit our racks, so we have to take cases off, drill new holes, add new plates to get them to fit our racks. And that's why you need robotics, yeah. And then somebody in the room went, why aren't we using standard racks? And the entire project, multi-million-dollar investment, disappeared in that one moment. Now, these people weren't daft. These people were trapped by past narrative. So at some point in the past, there was no such thing as standard racks. So they had custom-built racks. And they'd constantly been doing process improvement around this. And by simply, exposing this and allowing them to challenge their own narrative, that project disappeared. Now, this is the most common things I find are examples like that, examples where we don't understand our users and user needs, frighteningly enough. Most contract structures, if I map out the space and overlay the contracts, most contract structures are fundamentally flawed. I mean, horror shows in some cases. Misuse of methodologies, trying to do agile everywhere or Six Sigma everywhere or whatever. None of that stuff works. You have to apply them to context. Just a long list, but I suppose the biggest thing is providing ability for people to challenge what they're actually doing. And that's part of the problem with narratives.
So we talked about big money now, which is fine. I have a money question for you. What revenue stream surprised you by performing differently, better or worse, than you initially projected?
Are we talking about my little business?
Well, it could be your little business, or it could be a customer case study.
I suppose, well, there's revenue side. Okay, so there's multiple different angles here. So one of the things I liked was a particular project in UK government, which by simply mapping it out, they saved approximately 450 million, which was like, whoa, big money, fantastic. But then I had another project where we mapped it out, and this was a emergency services mobile communication platform, and we used it to say why the contracts were flawed and why we should never sign the paperwork. And unfortunately, they went ahead and ignored the maps because it was just me and a few policemen spent an afternoon creating the maps, and they went ahead and did the project anyway and wasted vast sums of money. Horror. So I'll often find examples of good and bad, but my favourite are things like James Finley's stuff with RNLA, which they use the mapping to help change the communication protocol. And as a result of that, they now...
What is the RNLA?
So, Royal National Lifeboat Association. The people who, when you fall into the river...
Lifeboat, okay.
The people who come and get you. And they would drastically reduce the speed at which they could do call-outs by changing the communication mechanisms. And I like that stuff because it saves lives. So money is, but saving lives is even better. One of the things that I do is I normally get large groups of people, like clinicians or people in manufacturing, whatever it happens to be, and we'll map out an entire industry. Now, that normally takes about 10 hours, and we'll do it from multiple different perspectives, and I've done about 17 different industries now. So things like defence, healthcare, education, etc. And then what we'll look at is investment in those industries from a point of social or market benefit. And what's interesting is they very rarely overlap. And so if you are looking in healthcare, if you're looking at social benefit, you're thinking about focusing on health outcomes or patient-reported outcome measures, data sharing. Whereas if you're focused on the market, it's preventive healthcare, even though we don't know what a healthy person actually looks like. It's all well-being, and then you're into the world of AI and all this sort of stuff. There's another angle, which is whether you're talking about social benefit and long-term social benefit, or whether you're talking about economic benefit as well. You can use maps of both of those. Just be warned, I have yet to find any industry where there is strong overlap between them. There you are, there's another thing I used to believe. I used to think that the market was really good at meeting people's actual needs. It's lousy at it. It's really good at it is maximizing resource extraction.
Okay. That's interesting, because these questions are just falling in on each other. How do you determine which aspects of your expertise to monetize versus what to give away freely?
Gosh. All right. So that's interesting, because when I teach people to map, I get them to map a tea shop, and then I usually get them to map something fantastical, like the underage magic detection system in the world of Harry Potter. Because, how do you do that without using magic? Because I tell them they can't use magic and you have to map it, and you can do both of those. And you can map anything in between. So, of course, back in a long time ago, I mapped mapping itself. So I used mapping to look at the area of mapping, to work out what my purpose was, and to look at different areas and which I could generate and create revenue. And so my purpose, and it has been for 20 years, is to rebel against all those consultancy organizations that enslave us with their lovely 2x2s and all the rest of it as well. I very much want people to map their own environments and to be able to understand their space and make decisions based upon technological, economic, social, and political landscapes they're operating in. Now, in order to do this, I made it all Creative Commons. So very simply, I worked on a basis, I'll take a tiny little bit of a very large pie. If I can get everybody to actually understand their landscape and understand their environment and use this stuff to help themselves, I'll pick up a little bit of work, a few retainers, and that is my business model. It's very small, as in a small piece of a large pie. I have no requirements or needs to a very simple and comfortable life. So I'm very fortunate and privileged to be able to play that game. So the primary focus for me has been getting people to map and understanding their environment and landscape and rebelling against the consultants that enslave us.
That's very interesting. I like the idea of using the mapping technology to map the mapping technology. I must admit, I've been using AI to understand more about AI.
So AI is really interesting because one of the things I did was a lot of maps in the serverless space. This is, if you think about cloud as compute shifting to a utility, it has a number of things. There's inertia to it. It creates a rapid explosion of higher order systems. It's known as a punctuated equilibrium. You get coevolution of practice, which eventually became DevOps. There are a whole bunch of standard patterns that you see. The same with serverless, which is the runtime, slightly higher up the stack, shifting to a utility. Things like Lambda, rapid explosion inertia, creation of new higher order systems, new practices, all standard. Now, one of the things we did in 2018 is I looked at the idea of machine cognition versus human cognition, and we could see it was industrializing. So we knew we'd get a utility form. We didn't know what it was going to be called. We knew we'd get a new set of practices. And what was fascinating was when we combined that together with what was going on in the serverless space, we'd get what we called conversational programming environments. So these are environments where you would have a conversation with a machine, and it dates all the way back to Nicholas Negroponte's Architecture by Yourself, which was based upon Jonna Freeman's graphical design theory. So if you think about the process of design, it's a conversation between the perspectives of multiple designers, and what would happen is one of the machines would be one of the designers. So that was 2018. A friend of mine, Alexander, built the system, an AI system you had a conversation with, and it built other applications for you, presented at AWS reInvent. So 2018, roll forward to 2022, 2023. We now have terms for this. So the large language models, large multimodal models, or the industrialized forms of this sort of cognition. Rather than conversational programming, we call it Vibe, we call it co-pilots, or whatever it happens to be. So we knew all this stuff. So back in 2018, you knew where to invest. We knew that this stuff was coming towards. Now, one of the interesting things about this space is that when you map it out, what you find is a number of things are changing. First of all, the language is changing. We're going from deterministic to more non-deterministic, so more conversational languages. The tool sets are changing. We're going from to much more conversational co-pilot environments, and the medium is changing. So we're going up from a world of code as text to code can be other things, such as images, so much more generative AI type space. And why that's interesting is because language, tools, and medium are how you reason about the world. So imagine if somebody controlled the printing press, the tool, paper, the medium, and the written word language. If that's controlled by a group of people, then they control how you reason about the world around you. And that's very dangerous, very powerful. I mean, I hear all these people talk about frontier AI, Skynet, and that's just childhood nightmares just coming through to adulthood. That's all. The real danger are things like conversational, this change of how we reason. So fascinating space.
Which begs the question, what comes after AI, or what does AI develop into?
Spime script. Oh, you do ask them. So so I did a talk about this at Eurofoo in 2004. Because back in the 1990s to early 2000s, I was doing a lot of stuff in 3D printing, and then later in 2000 to 2004, 2005, stuff in printed electronics. And so the talk about spine script was a realization that the function of something has two basic forms: a physical form and electronic form, digital form. And both of those were becoming more malleable over time. So now you've got this interesting position where, well, if I want to describe the function of something, if I have a language, we'll call it spine script to describe the function of something, then we have to decide what's going to be physical, what's going to be digital. And that's a great job for a compiler. So we're likely to see in the future a language like, I called it Spime Script back in 2000. Well, I renamed it to Spime Script because Bruce Sterling produced a wonderful book. I think it's called Making Things, which talked about spimes. You'll have to, Bruce Sterling, spimes, you'll find the book. And so I renamed it to Spime Script. So this is a language where we describe the function of something, and a compiler determines what's physical and digital. Now, why is that bigger than AI? Because the number of value chains, that technique, the blast radius, is much, much larger than, because it impacts everything. Absolutely everything we do in terms of manufacturing, construction, all over the place. So AI, wonderfully powerful, great fun, used in the right way. Spime Script is going to, I think, knock it out of the park. But there we are. That comes next. We're not there yet.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I've known you being in this space for at least 20 years, and now we're talking about what might be happening in the next 10 years.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so maybe the answer to my next question is already self-evident yet again, but I'm going to ask the question for clarity.
Mm-hmm.
How have you maintained your level of interest, quality and consistency over time in what you do without getting bored with it?
Well, first of all, I love mapping. And secondly, mapping is fundamentally about, when you map a space, you do it with others. Because the answers, whenever you think about a problem space, what I'm trying to do is map out that problem space. Other people have bits of the answers. The answers are never in the mind of a single person. And so maps become a great way of getting many people together and look around a space. So I love that sort of stuff. And that it's talking with others, mapping it out, challenging others, getting to a deep understanding. And that also leads me into different areas. So, for example, I'm working with a chap called Tudor on a book called Rewilding Software Engineering, because turns out, mapping out the problem of how we ask questions, how we answer questions, leads to some issues in the world of software engineering. So, to make it really simple, in physical engineering, whenever we have a problem, if it's not a known problem, we tend to build a tool for that problem. So, for example, I have in my kitchen, I have a blender. It's really good for making soups. I wouldn't use a blender to build a deep shaft mine. Build another tool to build a deep shaft mine. Okay. Now, in the world of software engineering, where all the code and the app and the tools are all symbolic instructions and very malleable, we've got ourselves stuck into this idea of having standardized tools, even though all the problems are highly contextual. So it's like we're using kitchen blenders everywhere, and then we're going, with kitchen blenders are better than humans with kitchen blenders at building deep mine shafts. And it's just like, well, maybe we shouldn't be using kitchen blenders. Maybe we should be using much more contextual tools. And these are the ideas behind rewilding software engineering.
How do you balance the standardization processes of what you do in the mapping process with maintaining the flexibility needed to see or stimulate innovation?
Well, first of all, maps themselves, if you look at the evolution axis at the bottom, there's only one axis, the evolution axis at the bottom, because what you've got is value chains or chains. So better clear up some terms. Value chains are within an organization, supply chains are across organizations. So supply chain is the wider. So whenever you look at, and basically it's a chain of needs, you have multiple chains of needs, and then you ask how evolved those components are. Now that evolution axis itself is based upon a piece of work that I did, which one of the axes is certainty, i.e. large chunks of the map are uncertain. And you can see that when you look at the map, because it's got genesis, and we call it the uncharted space, the Irby dragons. So when you look at a map and you map out a complex and complicated system, it can be both, You'll find many components are more to the right-hand side, more industrialized, more late product, more commodity spaces. And these are where standards come into play. In fact, different economic models, different purchasing models, different project management methods come into play. Whereas on the left-hand side, where it's in the uncharted space, the genesis, the early custom build, there is no space for standards because we're exploring. We don't even know what we actually want. This is one of the big problems with outsourcing contracts, because without mapping, what we tend to do is take the entire thing and wrap it in a sort of bounded context and give it to somebody to build. But only part of the map can we actually specify, the stuff which is highly industrialized on the right-hand side, and the stuff on the left, we're still exploring. So we're always going to get hammered with change control costs. And one of the common things I do is I help people map it out, and then we look at the contract, and it's like, don't sign that because you're just going to get massive cost overruns. Very high prediction rates are so easy and trivial to do. And it's the same with standards. Standards you need to understand the context, and you need to understand how evolved the components are before you start applying standards.
Okay, well, changing gears maybe to another section, but right at the beginning we discussed this, but off camera, but now to bring it back into focus. What unconventional approach have you taken to building community around your business?
Gosh, right. Well, there's first of all, the mapping sort of space, which I don't think is very unconventional. We do the usual, I made it all Creative Commons. Other people have built up communities. We do an event every couple of years known as Map Camp. There's a Discord channel, which I occasionally pop into, but lots of other people use. So it's the not unconventional approach. I mean, the most important thing with building a community is to realize that what matters most is not the person who creates the community, but the person who follows, particularly the early followers. So you have to support them. There's a wonderful video online, a YouTube video of how at a dance festival, I think it's called something like The Crazy Guy Dancing, and how one person on his own, other people join him and he supports them, and as a result you get this flood and an entire community of people doing this crazy dancing. It's a wonderful example of how you build community. So none of that's unconventional. That's all pretty much standard fare in terms of building communities, making it open, supporting others, providing places that people can go and talk. What is unconventional? Gosh, that is, I suppose, so for me, I mean, if I go back to 2003, 2004, 2005, when I had a small group for Tango, were based in London, but we had people working, we distributed workforce, so they could work anywhere in the world. So my financial controller was living in South Africa, one of my engineers was on a mountain in South Korea, another lived in Canada, so we encouraged people to be anywhere. We had all the usual sorts of bring your own device type things, this back in 2003. We got rid of all the sort of nonsense of everybody got a credit card, everybody set their own holidays, blah. We got rid of all of the paraphernalia and nonsense that rules we normally implement because somebody has abused something in the past. So we have to have a rule, and then you build up these rules, and then you find you can't do anything. So we did a real process of challenging and getting rid of all of that. But none of that, again, seems unconventional. It all seems like, you'd hope certainly standard fare, standard wisdom in the spaces I work in. Might seem unconventional to others.
Yeah, I think yes, it's down to perception. I think there's a lot of people who would take such a thing and would patent it and monetize it and hide it and
God knows.
Control it, and you've done the opposite by making it, So I would say that's reasonably an example of unconventionality, but not unconventional for you, perhaps, which is fine. A final question for you. What's your framework for deciding which clients or projects to pursue versus those which you decide to politely decline?
Oh, that's really good. That's really good. So one of the things I do is I map out cultural systems, and within that, what you have are behaviors and beliefs and doctrine. Doctrine being principles, beliefs being things we value, and the behaviors that result from that. For example, basic principle would be like focus on user needs, and your belief, if you believe everybody's equal, you'll focus on the needs of everyone. If you believe that you are, that somehow people with green eyes are better than everybody else, you'll focus on the needs of people with green eyes. So what I tend to do with an organization is I'll tend to listen to the problem space. I'll probably in the background map out their industry, but I'll also listen to them and look at their company. And I have something which I call the doctrine table, which is really good for trying to look at the sort of basic principles people use, but that doesn't tell me behavior. I also need to get an understanding or feeling about the beliefs. And that's difficult to do unless you're in that organization, unless they're quite clear. And they're often clear in terms of the actions. You can pick it up from the behaviors, not the words they use. That's generally marketing stuff, but in some of those behaviors. So I choose to work with organizations based upon industries that I find interesting, industries that I think there's going to be some social, it's not just purely market benefit, and organizations which I like the beliefs and the values of them. So I work with like Fenk, which is Tudor's group doing the rewilding software engineering. I like the group from eSynergy in the UK, so I publicly work with them as well. I think Patrick, I think, is a really interesting person. So I tend to base it upon those criteria.
I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.